When American forces set out to cross the Rhine River in March of 1945 to continue advancing into the heart of Germany, the heavily bombed city of Cologne stood in their way. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble during the war, but German forces still looked beneath the ashes of their homes and churches. More impressively, the striking Cologne Cathedral remained standing after having resisted dozens of bombs. Spearheading the assault into the country were the American T-26 Pershing tank crews. These brand new war vehicles were the American response to the ferocious Panther and Tiger tanks. In one of the main streets leading up to the cathedral, a Pershing heavy tank would come face to face with a lone Panther waiting to fight a last stand. In a matter of seconds, both tanks aligned their shots and aimed at each other. When World War II broke out in Europe in 1939, Blitzkrieg German forces demonstrated what tanks were capable of. These all-metal behemoths were no longer the slow and clunky prototypes first seen in the trenches of World War I. This new generation of armored vehicles was fast and powerful. The first Panzers were pivotal in taking Poland, France, Belgium, Holland, and most of the continent. But the German tank supremacy reached a halt in the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviet KV series heavy tank and the T-34 medium tank were the first armored opposition vehicles that the Panzer crews faced during the war. These Russian vehicles forced German engineers to develop medium and heavy tanks capable of overcoming the enemy, giving way to the first-generation Panther medium tank and the heavy Tiger tank. Both German tanks would prove extremely destructive on most fronts due to their thick armor plates and their deathly cannons that easily penetrated American and British defenses. The Americans had been using the M4 Sherman tank since 1942 and struggled to keep up with German technology. Although the M4 was effective enough and easily produced, its armor and 75mm cannon were highly vulnerable to Panthers and Tigers. German crews in the Western Front repeatedly joked that one Panther or Tiger tank was better than 10 American Shermans. The problem was, they said, that the Americans always showed up with more than 11. By 1944, American engineers began to work on a new tank model that could withhold the German Panzers. It was first designated Prototype T-20 and later T-26E1. The tank would carry a 90mm cannon, 4 inches of frontal armor, and a new transmission. It was classified as a heavy tank because of its 40-ton weight. Besides its thick armor and powerful cannon, this tank had a different firing mechanism. In contrast with the Sherman, which had a firing button on the floor that was activated by the gunner's foot, this had a trigger on the grip used to rotate the turret. When it was finished, the model was baptized as the Pershing tank in honor of the U.S. general that led the American Expeditionary Force during World War I. Less than 100 Pershing tanks arrived in Europe by February of 1945 to be tested by the best tank crews the U.S. had to offer. One of these early crews was led by Staff Sergeant Robert Early. Early's men had been fighting since September of 1944 and had proven their valor in combat. His tank gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had even made a name for himself due to his excellent aim and calm temperament under stressful situations. The tank crew tested the Pershing and immediately knew it was a powerhouse that could single-handedly take out a German Panzer. After a few days of practice, Early's crew was told that they would be spearheading the assault into the city of Cologne. To cross the Rhine and make their way to Berlin, they had to take control of the city and what remained of its bridges. On the night of March 3, 1945, the American 3rd Armored Division arrived in Cologne. The 2,000-year-old city founded by the Romans was crumbling, ravaged by Allied bombing raids. The Reich's fourth-largest city had lost more than 90% of its population, and few civilians still roamed the wrecked streets. What was left of the city was defended by the surviving members of the 3rd Panzergrenadier, 363rd Volksgrenadier, and 9th Panzer Divisions. The German troops were retreating to the banks of the Rhine to prevent the Allies from crossing. When most of the Cologne bridges were destroyed, some armored units stayed behind to keep fighting. On March 6th, Sergeant Bob Early's Pershing tank, nicknamed Eagle 7, arrived at Cologne. Corporal Smoyer heard his Lieutenant Bill Stillman say, quote, "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let's knock the hell out of it." The Eagle 7's crew included Sergeant Early, tank gunner Smoyer, loader John DeRiggi, driver Woody McVie, and radio operator Smokey David. The crew was idling at an intersection in Cologne, while some Sherman tanks advanced nearby towards the cathedral. The street was blocked, and the entire column of U.S. soldiers had come to a halt. Minutes before, the Eagle 7 crew had spotted a Panzer IV lurking across the streets, and a firefight had broken out. A civilian car was caught in the confrontation, and 2 civilians were wounded when both tank crews confused it for a military vehicle. The streets were silent once again, and the German hunter had disappeared. While Eagle 7 waited for the medics to tend to the injured civilians, 2 Sherman tanks from Fox Company advanced towards the Cologne Cathedral through another street. Led by seasoned veteran Lieutenant Karl Kellner, the tanks and the supporting infantry made their way through Komödienstrasse Street, which led to the train station. When the tanks stopped before a large pile of rubble, a German Panther aimed at them from a concealed position across the street. German Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth then ordered to fire at the Americans, and 2 47mm shells tore through Kellner's Sherman so quickly that his crew was not able to react. A third shot hit the tracks of the second Sherman and quickly reversed to go back into cover. Photographer Jim Bates, who was among the men that accompanied the infantry, filmed the entire incident. From the burning Sherman, Lieutenant Kellner emerged without his left leg. Some men rushed to aid him, but he perished an hour later. Bates stopped recording and ran back to Eagle 7 to warn Sergeant Early that a Panther was on the move near the cathedral. Both men ran across the street to see where the Panther was. They spotted it aiming directly towards Komödienstrasse Street, where the Sherman lay burning. The Panther was standing still in front of the cathedral, defiant as if making a last stand. Early decided that Eagle 7 would flank it from another street, and the 2 men ran towards the Pershing. Early laid out the plans to his crew, and Bates ran to a nearby building to record the inevitable confrontation. As Eagle 7 moved towards its objective, Early told the Sherman crews to stand back. Tank gunner Smoyer told Early he would aim at the Panzer's hull to guarantee a clear hit. Early replied, quote, "Shoot whatever you want. He's just sitting there like he owns the place." The crew loaded an armor-piercing round for a last reload, and Smoyer turned the turret to the right as far as he could to avoid hitting the adjacent building. Lieutenant Bartelborth knew an unknown tank was coming because of the particular sound it emitted, and turned their turret straight to the corner in which Eagle 7 would cross. American crew members McVeigh and Davis were the first to spot the Panther as it was pointing at them. McVeigh then nervously hit the pedal to avoid the Panther's line of fire. Bartelborth and his crew were confused. They had never seen a Pershing before, and they thought it could be a German tank. Those seconds proved valuable, as Smoyer did not hesitate to shoot, and the Panther immediately caught fire. Bartelborth and 3 crew members ran for cover. In Eagle 7, DeRiggi loaded another shell that was followed by another hit. The gunner inside the Panther tried to get out, but a third strike prevented it. The German tank exploded in bright flames. Smoyer would later tell HistoryNet, quote, "People always ask why I fired 3 times, not giving the German crew a chance to fire. Well, that was the rule. Any crewman still alive in that Panther could have pulled the trigger, and with that powerful gun pointing at us, we would all be dead and not here to tell the tale." Meanwhile, photographer Jim Bates captured the whole encounter, even closing his shot with the spires of the imposing cathedral. For their actions during that fateful day, Staff Sergeant Robert Early and Tank Gunner Corporal Clarence Smoyer were notified that they would receive the Bronze Star. However, it was uncovered that Smoyer had interacted with some German children in the streets. Since fraternization with the enemy was forbidden, the military police removed his name, and the recognition was nullified. Thanks to the petition placed by author Adam Makos to recognize Smoyer's bravery, the Army reconsidered and awarded him the Bronze Star 75 years later. 3 additional Bronze Stars were also awarded to the rest of the Eagle 7 team, becoming one of the most celebrated crews in Army history. Smoyer, a 21-year-old frail-looking officer during the battle, would be known from then on as the hero of Cologne. During World War II, the Wehrmacht sent messages over the radio, singling out a few men of the millions serving, and it was the highest honor any soldier of any rank could receive. Throughout the entire conflict, only one non-commissioned officer of the German tank arm was named in the Wehrmacht radio communique: Kurt Knispel. Although he was the best Panzer ace, with a reported 168 tank kills, he never received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, despite being recommended 4 times. Knispel had a knack for breaking the rules, sported long hair and a beard, and had a particular disdain for abusive SS officers, which earned him more than a few enemies within the ranks. Even so, he's widely considered the most successful tank ace of World War II. And yet, the affable rule breaker is also the most forgotten Panzer ace of them all. When Sudetenland, today part of the Czech Republic, was occupied by Nazi Germany on October 1, 1938, Kurt Knispel was only 17 years old. From a young age, Knispel became enamored with the automobile industry and loved working on mechanized machines and vehicles. Then, in 1940, he joined the Heer Wehrmacht forces. Knispel started his basic training at the Panzer Replacement Training Battalion in Sagan, Lower Silesia, and his favorite lessons were those related to armored warfare in some of Germany's most impressive tanks, like the Panzer I, II, and IV. The young man was then transferred to a field unit of the 12th Panzer Division, where he completed his training as a loader and gunner on the Panzer IV. And while his superiors immediately noticed his extraordinary abilities as a gunner, Knispel remained a loader. As part of the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, the 12th Panzer Division joined the battle against Soviet Russia in June of 1941 as part of Operation Barbarossa, when Nazi Germany invaded the territory. By July, still in Soviet territory, and with Knispel's Panzer tank damaged beyond repair, his unit was transferred to Army Group North, and the men set course towards Leningrad. That is when Knispel and his Panzer IV tank were suddenly hit by a Soviet shell. While the entire crew jumped out of the hit tank, Kurt Knispel stayed inside. Determined, he looked through his periscope, spotted the enemy's T-34 tank, and destroyed it. It would become the first tank to be knocked out by Knispel's sharp eye. After months of fighting, Leningrad remained in Soviet hands. During the operation, the 29th Panzer Regiment suffered dearly, and the 9th Company was merged with Knispel's 3rd. Knispel then met Obergefreiter Alfred Rubbel, a fearless tank commander who became close friends with him. According to Rubbel, Knispel never abandoned his comrades, even in the most challenging situations. On May 17, 1942, Knispel and his unit returned to Germany. Upon arriving in the motherland, a brand new Panzer IV tank, installed with a long-barrel 75mm gun, was awaiting both Rubbel and Knispel. During a short leave, the men learned that their unit would be attached to the 3rd Abteilung, Panzer Regiment 4 of the 13th Panzer Division. While the majority of the newly reformed unit was already on its way to Ukraine, Rubbel and Knispel had to wait a few days to get used to their new vehicle. Then, on the way to their latest mission, their train was stopped in Krakow, Poland. Out of nowhere, Knispel heard cries and yelling in Russian and immediately rushed to the scene, where he found a Soviet prisoner being mistreated and abused by a Schutzstaffel guard. With a pistol in hand and a furrowed brow, Knispel intervened and got into an altercation with the SS guard. Soon, the outspoken young soldier fell out of grace with the German military police and army. And while his commander would constantly stick up for him during his service, Knispel would be repeatedly denied medals and recognition, not to mention moving through the ranks. The truth is, Knispel was a born rule-breaker. With tattoos, a goatee, longer than allowed hair, and a strong distaste for injustice, he was not just another soldier, and clearly stood out from the crowd. Even so, he was well liked by his comrades, and his skills were never matched. Knispel and the rest of his unit arrived in Ukraine on August 4, 1942, joining the 4th Panzer Regiment in action in the Caucasus Mountains, a small region between the Black and the Caspian Seas. During the battles there, Knispel added 12 more tanks to his kill list, finally earning some official recognition, getting promoted to Unteroffizier and receiving the Iron Cross 2nd Class. He was also among the few lucky soldiers to man the new Tiger I tank. After a Christmas break, Knispel was placed in the 1st Company of the Schwere Panzer Abteilung 503 Heavy Tank Battalions. Then, in the spring of 1943, Knispel and his new unit set course towards the east to participate in Operation Citadel. Also known as the Battle of Kursk, the operation was one of the largest and most significant tank battles in history. Beginning on July 5, 1943, Knispel and the Heavy Tank Battalion 503 were tasked with opening up the roads for the 6th Panzer Division on the right flank of the massive Operation Citadel, and he successfully eliminated several anti-tank positions. Knispel was on a roll. 2 days later, he managed to destroy a Soviet T-34 almost a mile away in a single shot, destroying 7 more the next day, with a few as far away as 1.25 miles. Then, when his platoon bumped into a Soviet column of 14 tanks, the Germans opened fire and destroyed 11 in minutes. Knispel broke his own record on July 16th, when his platoon was tasked with helping a cavalry brigade from falling into Soviet hands, and he destroyed an enemy tank almost 3 miles away. For the next several months, the 503 Heavy Tank Battalion helped out several German units from being decimated by the Russians. During a nighttime mission, Knispel was positioned as a tank commander around Auschwitz when he heard Soviet tanks closing in on their location. Then, when a third Tiger joined the party, all hell broke loose. During the kerfuffle, the German commanders lit the sky while trying to set the Soviet tanks ablaze. However, the battle was over when the third Tiger was hit by a T-34 and Knispel's engine overheated. Ultimately, Knispel destroyed a whopping 27 tanks during the Kursk campaign, and for his incredible actions, he received the Iron Cross First Class. As September of 1943 came to a close, Knispel had racked up 80 downed enemy tanks. In January, Knispel and the 34 Tiger tanks of the 503 Heavy Tank Battalion were integrated into the armored Kampfgruppe and tasked with liberating men trapped at the Shakazi Pocket. During the mission, the Tiger Group took out an astonishing 267 Soviet tanks. By spring, Kurt Knispel was destroying one Soviet tank after another, and his count surpassed 100 kills. He would then receive the German Cross in gold. Days before the Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, Knispel and his men returned to Germany, where they received the brand new King Tiger tanks, and the 503 were immediately sent to France to deal with the unstoppable Allied threat. Despite massive success on the Eastern Front, Knispel only destroyed 2 Allied tanks in Normandy, most likely because of the different nature of combat and the battlefield conditions. Then, as the battalion was sent back to Germany for one more reformation near the end of August, Knispel was granted a visit to his hometown. Even so, he was back on the battlefield by October, and he and his unit were sent to the outskirts of Skonamedi, Hungary, where he secured his 126th hit. His commander, Captain Dr. Dienst Kerber, recommended him for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of 4 times Knispel's commanders did so throughout the war to recognize his outstanding courage, situational awareness, and superb handling of weaponry. However, he would never receive the prestigious award, and would become an ace of aces without the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross under his belt. By 1945, the German stance in the war had alarmingly worsened. In Slovakia and Hungary, the Tigers of the 503 Heavy Tank Battalion suffered dearly, and by April, only 8 of the 34 mighty German tanks remained, including Knispel's. Even so, he would continue to rack up kills. As the end of the month approached, the remnants of the 503 were sent to Vlasice, a town between Brno and Vienna, and Knispel was promoted to staff sergeant. He then departed for his last battle on April 28th. Knispel secured his 168th kill in German-occupied Czechoslovakia. By then, however, he was being overwhelmed by Soviet armor. Immobilized and encircled, his Tiger II received a decisive blow, and the legendary Kurt Knispel was mortally wounded. The 23-year-old soldier lost his life only a week before the war ended. Almost 70 years later, Czech archaeologists discovered 16 German soldiers buried on the church grounds of Verbovich. Identified thanks to his dog tags, the Ace of Aces found his final resting place in 2014. With 126 victories as a gunner and 42 as a tank commander, Kurt Knispel went down in history as one of the most successful ace tankers in the war. However, the soldier's name never became popular, mainly because he didn't get to write a memoir or because he fought for the wrong side of history. Even so, his talent could not be denied. At first glance, the Storm Tiger looks like a bloated Tiger I tank with an equally comical short barrel mounted on top. However, the self-propelled assault gun was an overwhelming fortification destroyer and a promising solution that would make the German blitzkrieg even more terrifying. With armor plates as thick as 150 millimeters and shooting shells weighing over 800 pounds, the unstoppable behemoth was impervious to almost every conventional weapon on the battlefield. But its development was actively racing against the might of the Allied offensive throughout every front, and German engineers fought to deploy the motorized gun before it was too late. When it finally reached the battlefront, its capabilities proved astounding, taking 3 US Sherman tanks out of action and even razing entire building blocks to the ground. The Sturmtiger was ready to leave its mark on history. Ever since their inception, tanks were concocted as a way to strike heavily reinforced positions from a protected and mobile platform. The first time tanks were used in a major conflict, the US showed the primitive Renault FT could achieve just that when they became vital in storming the fortified German positions across the Somme salient. But soon the war evolved, and tanks started encountering other tanks on the battlefield. Their primary function then shifted from engaging fortified positions to dealing with the enemy while providing cover to infantry fighters. With time, however, the original purpose of the tank would resurface as a specialized vehicle designed to obliterate even the most robust ramparts. The idea was simple: take a large artillery gun and mount it into a heavy tank. Thus, odd yet devastating machines such as the Sturmtiger were born. As one of the prime examples of the self-propelled assault guns of World War II, the 65-ton metal beast was a unique contraption, attained by placing a colossal 380mm RW-61 rocket launcher into the chassis of a Tiger I battle tank. The result was a strange, almost comical-looking combat vehicle. However, its ability to deal damage was anything but humorous. Its main gun was initially designed as a naval depth charge launcher, modified to serve as a land artillery solution. The payload was launched via a 2-stage rocket propellant system. The first smaller charge expelled the projectile a short distance, just enough to clear the barrel. After this, a more powerful solid fuel charge would detonate, sending the enormous 800-pound shell across distances up to 4 miles away. The result was a devastating solution that could penetrate even the most reinforced military fortifications used by the enemy. In fact, the projectile could pierce up to 8 feet of reinforced concrete, making it almost impossible for an enemy position to prevail after being struck by one of the Sturmtiger's devastating shells. The raw devastation caused by the Sturmtiger came at a considerable price, something that had to be accounted for in tactical assessments. For one, the motorized gun could only carry a maximum of 14 projectiles, which meant carrying one of the shells inside the breech. More often than not, the vehicles would go into battle equipped with only 13 rounds, and every shot had to be carefully planned beforehand to guarantee an adequate performance. The shell's size and weight also made the reloading extraordinarily cumbersome and slow. It required the concerted effort of all 4 crew members and a specialized crane mounted on the rear deck. The excruciating process took around 10 minutes at the hands of an experienced crew. As such, the gun had no way of firing one shot after another, and most of the time it would fire once and then change position and tactics before firing again. The Sturmtiger also had to retreat after each shot because of the enormous risk of being spotted. The 2-charge detonation left a significant trail of fire, smoke, and fumes, easily detectable from a long distance. Nevertheless, the problem was compounded by the way the Sturmtiger dealt with the gases released during the first combustion. As the first charge was triggered inside the barrel, the gases could not be released into the crew compartment as it would poison the vehicle's operators. Holding the fumes inside the barrel until it was clear was also not an option, as the pressure was massive and it could risk blowing up the entire short barrel. To solve the issue, the gun's barrel was fitted with a series of small perforations surrounding the central barrel opening. The gases expelled by the initial detonation were turned back inside the barrel and released through those smaller openings, ensuring the pressure inside the gun was never too great. Nevertheless, the sudden release of fumes on top of the second charge detonation made for a spectacular burst of light, fire, and smoke, making the firing Sturmtiger much more accessible to locate than other artillery solutions. Because of this, it became standard practice for the Sturmtiger's operators to move to a safer position after firing a shell. Despite its operating shortcomings, the Storm Tiger carried a tremendous firepower capability inside an extremely fortified armored vehicle. Like many tank hunter hull designs of the time, the Storm Tiger was manufactured with a casemate-style exterior design with a sloping front glacis plate that would allow most enemy projectiles to be deflected on impact instead of penetrating the armor. But even if the projectile managed to pierce the inclined surface, it would be almost impossible to penetrate the 150mm thick reinforced plates mounted on the front of the vehicle. This configuration significantly upgraded Tiger I's 100mm frontal armor plate. In the rest of the vehicle, the armor thickness ranged from 60 to 100mm, depending on the vulnerability of the vehicle's components being protected and the likelihood of an enemy attack striking that location. All in all, the Storm Tiger was a fortified behemoth that was mainly invulnerable to most enemy weapons from other artillery guns. Even the mighty T-34 Soviet battle tank and its 76 2mm gun could not pierce through the frontal armor plates of the self-propelled German mortar. And it would often take a lucky shot from the late-coming T-34-85 Soviet battle tank's upgraded 85mm main gun to stand a chance against the unyielding defenses of the Storm Tiger. If any infantry troops dared get close to the self-propelled gun to plant explosives or sabotage the tracks, the crew inside the vehicle could also defend themselves with the help of the MG-34 machine gun mounted at the front of the unit. The crew consisted of the driver, the gunner, the loader, and the commander. The loader, who would not be required to load shells at all times, was also entrusted with the tasks of a radio man and the operator of the anti-infantry frontal machine gun. The Storm Tiger was designed as an offensive weapon, capable of moving as fast as other armored units while supporting infantry as they advanced into heavily built-up enemy territories. The gun was built to destroy enemy fortifications, forcing them to rout into the muzzles of the assaulting infantry and panzer divisions. Nevertheless, by the time the Storm Tiger blasted into the scene during the last months of the war, Germany was not doing much attacking, instead fighting a defensive war on most fronts. A couple of prototype units were hastily rushed into the battlefront during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, where the vehicle was an ideal solution to deal with the heavy enemy resistance hiding in dense urban areas and reinforced buildings. Although their numbers hindered any battle-defining actions, the prototype Storm Tiger was reported to perform more than adequately in supporting the German infantry as it fought off the Polish resistance. Numerous buildings in Warsaw had been razed to the ground thanks to the overpowering firepower of the Storm Tiger, and the Polish fighter did not have the capacity to counter the heavily armored vehicle. After its crucial role in the Warsaw Uprising, the Storm Tiger would go on to see action in more significant numbers in the final Wehrmacht efforts to defend Germany. After being put into a position for which it had not been intended, the self-propelled gun was of little significance in the fight against the Allied rush to Berlin. As a defensive weapon, its cumbersome nature and low accuracy made it nearly useless. Even so, during the battle for the bridge at Remagen, German forces deployed 7 Storm Tigers to help in the defensive efforts. However, when the time to blow up the bridge came, the Storm Tigers proved incapable of accomplishing their task, as their lousy accuracy prevented their guns from hitting the structure. Despite their failure, one of the units is credited with achieving an incredible feat during the fierce battle. According to German reports, a Storm Tiger operating near Düren allegedly hit a group of Sherman tanks stationed at a village with a 380mm round, destroying 3 of them with a single shot. The extraordinary feat is still highly debated, and it was never confirmed by the Allied authorities. However, there's no question the mighty Storm Tiger had the power and range needed to achieve such a formidable accomplishment. Ultimately, the weapon was an impressive concept that showed remarkable promise as a devastating mobile platform for offensive operations. Its limited combat experience showed that it had the potential to be a game-changer for the Wehrmacht, but it arrived too late. When the German Atlantic Wall was breached after the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, the Wehrmacht knew that it was a matter of time before they had to withdraw from France. Underpowered and ill-trained German ghost divisions fought desperately against overwhelming odds, as American forces were eager to take the fight into the heart of Berlin. As a counteroffensive to recapture the Allied-occupied Lorraine region in northeastern France, German forces clashed with American troops in the Battle of Aricourt during September of 1944. The battle confronted 2 World War I veterans who specialized in tank warfare. U.S. Colonel Bruce Clark and his 4th Armored Division faced the relentless 5th Panzer Army of General Hasso von Manteuffel. Although the German general knew that Hitler's idea of a renovated offensive was unsupportable by then, he opted to fight bravely by surprising the Americans with an unexpected armored attack. The encounter became the most significant armored confrontation between U.S. and German forces up to that point in the war. Having initially undervalued their opponent, the Americans were obliged to reorganize and use creative strategic tactics if they wanted to outmaneuver the feared Nazi panzers. On June 6, 1944, after months of planning one of the most ambitious operations of all time, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the Normandy beaches in northern France to begin the liberation of Europe. Establishing beachheads proved a costly ordeal for the invading forces. The U.S. Army Rangers suffered many losses at the Utah and Omaha beaches. Machine gun fire from German pillboxes ravaged the coasts with tremendous effectiveness. Although German units stationed in France to protect the Atlantic Wall were no longer the powerful blitzkrieg forces that they used to be, the bunkers and coastal defenses were tactically placed to deal maximum damage on the enemy. After weeks of intense firefights in towns and villages around the area, the Allied command was satisfied with the operation. With the Atlantic Wall breached, a second amphibious landing was planned to take over the south of France and flank the Germans from all sides, forcing them to flee the country. Operation Dragoon was launched on August 15, 1944. Allied forces were able to secure vital ports along the Mediterranean coast, including Toulon and Marseille. The strategy opened supply lines that helped the troops fighting in the north, as they were running out of fuel, ammunition, and food. By mid-September, the Wehrmacht forces realized that they were being encircled and cut off from their communication lines and eventual reinforcements, so they escaped and retreated from Dijon and southern France. But the fight was not over yet, and German forces began to plan for a counterattack. Hitler and his generals believed that they could land a crushing blow on the Allies and retake France. The attack would be a risky proposition, as the Heer had already lost more than 300,000 men when they were encircled in the Falaise Gap in northern France just 1 month before. German forces had also suffered a heavy blow in the Eastern Front during the Soviets' Operation Bagration. General George S. Patton's Third Army was spearheading the Allied advance into the region of Lorraine, near the German border. The Germans planned to launch a massive armored counteroffensive with recently formed panzer brigades to encircle the Allied forces. Hitler chose General Hasso von Manteuffel to lead the bold counteroffensive in Lorraine. The general was a World War II cavalry officer and an expert in armored warfare. Manteuffel came with an admirable record. In his book, Lorraine 1944, author Stephen J. Zaloga wrote that Manteuffel had commanded an infantry battalion in General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division in France in 1940, a regiment in Moscow in 1941, and a brigade with the Afrika Korps in 1943. Although Manteuffel had no experience as a Panzer Corps commander, Hitler trusted him with the ambitious task. Manteuffel had rightfully earned a Knight's Cross and an Oak Leaf after 5 long years of continued armored combat. The German units that would participate in the counteroffensive were not highly experienced. According to author Zaloga, none of them were rated at Comfort 1. And the units were a mix of veteran troops, underage cadets, and old men conscripted to fill the ranks of fallen men. Manteuffel had less than 400 artillery devices on hand, and his Panzer Grenadier divisions had no armor at all. But the tanks at Manteuffel's disposal made for a formidable fighting force. The new Panzer brigades consisted of about 100 new tanks, including Tigers and Panthers. Overall, Manteuffel had 300 tanks to push forward on enemy lines, but his crew had no combat experience. The Allied invasion in Lorraine was commanded by legendary General George S. Patton, a controversial American hero with a long family military tradition who earned the Distinguished Service Cross in World War I. But even though he was known for his aggressive mobile warfare tactics, he was not very familiar with tank technology. Colonel Bruce Clark, who would eventually be put in charge of the American defense and confront Manteuffel face-to-face in Lorraine, would later say of General Patton, quote, "Patton knew as little about tanks as anybody I ever knew." Colonel Clark's U.S. forces were at full combat strength, motivated, equipped, and with plenty of artillery support. Although older than those of the enemy, the U.S. Army had more than 800 functional tanks, including M5A1 light tanks, M4s, M10s, and M18 tank destroyers. On September 18th, under heavy fog, German armored units of the 111th Panzer Brigade attacked the town of Luneville. The Americans were caught by surprise and lost tanks during the fight. When they were about to be surrounded by the northeast and southeast flanks, reinforcements from the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions arrived with a company of tanks and tank destroyers. The Germans retreated 1 day later, having lost more than 24 panzers and around 1,000 men. American losses were also in the hundreds. U.S. Colonel Clark, realizing that his planned offensive had just turned into a defensive operation, retained his artillery near a fortified perimeter and amassed all his units in Aracourt. He then sent, quote, quick forays out at night to hit the fortified enemy-held towns and returned fast inside the perimeter. The German 5th Panzer Army, having failed to take Luneville, headed to Aracourt on the morning of September 19th to surround Clark's troops. Punches began to gather south and east of Clark's position, waiting for additional units to initiate the engagement. Clark ordered his units to immediately attack the outnumbered enemy forces. 2 tank destroyer platoons and a company of Shermans charged toward the panzers. American forces quickly flanked the Germans and destroyed 10 panzers under the cover of intense fog. However, they suffered similar casualties under sustained fire from Panther tanks nearby. Before withdrawing, Manteuffel ordered one more charge against American troops in Aracourt. If he could breach Clark's perimeter, he would take down the artillery emplacements that were attacking his panzers from afar. During the offensive on September 20th, U.S. pilot Major Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, aboard a Piper Cub aircraft, fired a dozen bazooka rockets in a series of passes towards the advancing German tank units. He was credited with knocking out 6 tanks, including a heavy Tiger I. By the end of the day, armored units from the U.S. 37th Tank Battalion had destroyed 16 enemy tanks across several villages and fields. Out of the 180 Panzers of the 111th and 113th Brigades that began the offensive, Manteuffel was left with barely 60 tanks. The inexperienced German tank crews also inflicted heavy damage on the U.S. tanks, losing about the same amount. But the cost was higher for the Panzer units. Even though the eye-to-eye combat appeared to be even in sheer strength, the German formations lacked the resources to replace lost units. During the following days, Manteuffel seized control of the Bezons forest area to advance through the village of Lizay and attack it from the north. Aided by 12 tanks, Panzer Grenadiers destroyed 4 U.S. Stuart tanks near the village of Lay, but Hellcats from the Tank Destroyer Battalion reached the area and blew out 3 Panzers before retreating. By noon on September 22nd, German forces stood down in Juvisy and Lizay, taking a breather from the fierce armored mobile warfare around them. As Manteuffel's forces grew thinner with each passing day, the Americans only grew stronger. Colonel Clark received air support from P-47 Thunderbolts when the skies cleared, and the aircraft began dropping ordnance on every German formation they encountered along the region. By September 26th, the battered German forces set their sights on Chateau Saline and almost defeated the American troops before air and artillery support forced the Germans to retreat. In one last effort to break the Allied perimeter and keep control of Hill 265, the 5th Panzer Army attacked U.S. forces on September 29th. But the Germans were defeated and lost 36 tanks and around 700 men. The Battle of Aracourt ended in a stalemate and is regarded as one of the most embittered tank combats in history. To Hitler's dismay, the German offensive only halted the American-led advance into southeastern France temporarily. Once General Patton's forces received fuel supplies, they advanced relentlessly into the heart of the German motherland. If it wasn't for President Dwight D. Eisenhower's recent deal with the Soviet Union on reaching a halt in the outskirts of Berlin, Patton would have set foot in the city first. But Patton was an obstinate combatant who preferred to fight offensively. This was later reinforced by General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, the 5th Panzer Army's Chief of Staff, who wrote, quote, "On September 21st, it looked as though the Americans were determined to force their way through to the Saar and the Rhine. And General Patton might well have done so if he had been given a free hand. At that time, the West Wall was still unmanned, and no effective defense could have been made there." Meanwhile, Manteuffel's army was left with barely 25 functioning tanks. After 11 days of continuous battle in Aracourt, Manteuffel's panzer formations and armored units were decimated by U.S. artillery and tanks. The remaining German forces withdrew from Lorraine towards the Siegfried Line. They would continue defending German territory until the Reich surrendered to the Western Front before the summer of 1945. At the end of the Cold War, the sizable communist empire of the Soviet Union shattered into several independent states. While most faced economic challenges, they inherited well-armed militaries. One of the weapons they were left with was the T-64. Born at the height of the Cold War, the T-64 was a marvel of its era, with trailblazing attributes, a robust engine, an automatic loading system, superior composite armor, and a shield against nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. However, despite its groundbreaking innovations, the T-64's potential was initially overshadowed by its hidden shortcomings. Now, in a twist of destiny, Ukraine has rekindled the might of the T-64, turning it against its erstwhile allies. As the echoes of a bygone era reverberate, this Cold War beast has risen, proving that its battle spirit remains undiminished. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union produced the most innovative yet problematic tank of the late 20th century, the T-64. Renowned tank designer Alexander Morozov, whose claim to fame was the creation of the T-34 and T-54, led the development of the T-64. Manufactured in Kharkiv, modern-day Ukraine, the new design sought to gain qualitative superiority on the battlefield by taking on the standard four-man main battle tanks of its Western opposition. To achieve this, the T-64, built for battlefield supremacy, boasted a series of pioneering features. Central to the tank's design was its 5TDF engine, a compact powerhouse that delivered 700 horsepower. This mechanical marvel, half the size and weight of traditional engines, endowed the T-64 with exceptional agility, allowing it to reach 45 miles per hour. The T-64 became the world's pioneer of multi-layer laminate and composite armor. This intricate defense mechanism dissipated the destructive energy of enemy fire, making this Soviet beast nearly indestructible. Despite the heavy armament and armor akin to a heavyweight, the T-64 tipped the scales at a mere 42 short tons. Another groundbreaking addition was the autoloader system that complemented the tank's main 125mm smoothbore gun, at the time the largest main gun mounted on any tank in the world. This innovative feature stored and loaded shells rapidly, shortening the interval between shots and reducing the standard crew number from 4 to 3. Designed with an eye on the nuclear realities of its time, the T-64 featured an overpressure system that sealed its interior from chemical, biological, or nuclear threats. It carried a built-in fire suppression system to combat the risk of internal fires, reinforcing the T-64 as a veritable fortress on tracks. In this way, the T-64 emerged from Kharkiv, not just as another Soviet tank, but as a revolutionary testament to Soviet military technology. Upon its inauguration into operational service with the Soviet Army in 1964, the T-64 was entrusted to the elite ranks of the Soviet tank regiments. Its deployment was especially prominent within the group of Soviet forces in Germany, a critical component of the Warsaw Pact's bulwark against NATO in East Germany. As was common with Soviet models, the T-64 was cloaked in secrecy. Its cutting-edge technical specifications were tightly guarded, obscuring not only its capabilities, but also its many shortcomings. Of these, the most glaring was the unreliable engine and its flawed autoloader, infamous for its propensity to mangle the arms of unlucky gunners. Such technical failures were problematic and certainly inconvenient, yet they remained a clandestine affair for decades. From 1964 to 1987, a relatively modest count of 13,000 T-64s rolled off the production lines. Along with the tank's substantial cost, more than the less intricate T-72, this reflected the difficulties and financial implications tied to its production. By the end of the 1960s, it became evident that the T-64, despite its innovative design, wouldn't become the Soviet Army's go-to tank. While innovative, it was riddled with significant drawbacks that held it back from exportation outside the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the T-64 left an indelible mark on Soviet tank development history. It began a notable lineage of T-series tanks, with each subsequent model, including the T-72 and its modifications, the T-80, the T-80U, the T-80UD, and Ukraine's T-84, inheriting design concepts from the T-64. Despite its initial challenges, the T-64 did not go completely obsolete. Throughout the tempestuous 1980s, as the Soviet Union moved towards its dissolution, the T-64 underwent several intensive modernization programs. These endeavors led to the T-64A and T-64BV variants, with superior firepower and protection through anti-tank guided missile systems and enhanced armor. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, only 3 tank production plants remained in operation. 2 of these, the principal manufacturers of the T-80, T-72, and T-90, were situated within the Russian Federation in the historic city of St. Petersburg. The remaining factory, dedicated to the production of the T-64, was nestled in Kharkiv, within the confines of the newly independent state of Ukraine. At the time of this monumental geopolitical shift, the Ukrainian army had approximately 2,000 T-64s, 1,000 T-72s, and 300 T-80s at their disposal, creating a robust foundation for their armored forces. As the turn of the century neared, the steadily aging T-64s underwent a thorough rejuvenation process carried out by the Ukrainian army, albeit constrained by limited financial resources. In 1999, the first revitalized T-64BM Bullets emerged from the Kharkiv factory, marking a new chapter for this veteran war machine. The Bullets were endowed with a sophisticated fire control system and gun stabilization for enhanced accuracy, capable of deploying anti-tank guided missiles, and featured advanced explosive reactive armor, an engine with increased power, and cutting-edge electronics. In 2005, the T-64BM Bullets officially entered Ukrainian service, standing as a locally produced symbol of military acumen. Ukrainian-held T-64s saw their trial by fire in 2014, when the shadow of conflict darkened eastern Ukraine, spurred by Russia's support for local insurgents. At the dawn of the conflict, Ukraine's armored cavalry comprised 720 battle-ready T-64BVs and T-64BMs, bolstered by a reserve of another 600. However, despite their significant upgrades, these tanks quickly fell prey to the lethal efficiency of insurgents armed with anti-tank infantry weapons. This vulnerability echoed the susceptibility of their Russian counterparts to similar weapons, highlighting a fundamental weakness in their design. The invasion of Crimea by Russia proved a costly engagement for Ukraine. After enduring losses, the remaining T-64BM tanks were meticulously repaired and relegated to storage. This surprising move saw Ukraine favoring the older T-64BV model for frontline duty. The turmoil catalyzed a vigorous modernization effort directed at the fleet. In this endeavor, a considerable number of T-64BVs were upgraded with modern optics, passive infrared sights, and snugly fitted reactive armor blocks. This model wasn't a fresh introduction in 2014. Rather, it represented a modernized variant of the existing T-64BVs. The revised T-64BV variant, tested by conflict, was about to face its ultimate challenge, standing its ground against even the latest Russian tanks. By 2022, modernized versions of the T-64 had evolved into the mainstay of Ukraine's tank arsenal. When Russia commenced its invasion in February of that year, Ukraine, despite being outnumbered, rallied all available tanks to confront and ultimately repel the enemy. These reimagined T-64BVs have displayed remarkable tenacity, even when pitted against more modern Russian tanks, particularly in clashes like the one near Chernihiv in the spring of 2022. In the intense combat that unfolded during the initial weeks of the widespread war, Ukraine's 1st Tank Brigade strategically positioned its fleet of approximately 100 T-64BVs within the forested buffer zone between Chernihiv and the neighboring Kyiv. As Russian tanks swept by, the T-64BV crews initiated their assault at point-blank range, leveraging their faster autoloaders to gain the upper hand over Russian crews, and the 1st Tank Brigade emerged victorious in the Battle of Chernihiv. However, the sheer ferocity of the conflicts has inflicted heavy tank losses on both Ukraine and Russia. By mid-April, Ukraine had lost 110 T-64BVs, and on April 25th, Russia claimed its first T-64BM victory. In the same time frame, the Russians had suffered 16 losses of their own T-64BVs. Ukraine's counterattacking forces had repelled the Russians from Kharkiv by mid-May 2022. T-64s built there likely led the charge. In August 2022, Ukrainian sources alleged that a T-64BV took down an undisclosed Russian vehicle at a staggering distance of 6.5 miles. If confirmed, this kill doubles the previous record of 3.1 miles held by a Challenger 1 tank. According to Ukrainian sources, this was accomplished by launching 20 125mm high-explosive shells, with a drone directing the barrage. This strategy rendered the Russian vehicle unable to retaliate, tipping the balance of the encounter in Ukraine's favor. As of 2023, T-64 crews have increasingly been tasked with fulfilling artillery roles, leading to a scarcity of 125mm ammunition. When Russian infantry forces are dispatched directly to the battlefield, the T-64 crews are called upon to support the troops. After discharging their firepower at a target, they relocate and repeat their assault, with attack helicopters and drones providing critical support. However, eventually, Ukraine will exhaust its supply of T-64s. Although the Kharkiv tank plant could manufacture a limited number of new models using long-stored components, it's unlikely that production could keep pace with losses in the long term. Facing this challenging reality, Ukraine is strategically investing in the T-84 Oplot tanks, a wholly Ukrainian design, first manufactured in 1994, which is now experiencing a resurgence amidst the throes of war. As the T-64, a relic of a bygone era, continues its valiant fight, Ukraine looks ahead, ready to pen a new chapter in its military history. The 1920s and 30s were marked by the military development of super tanks. At the time, it was believed that the future of military conflicts lay with these machines, with the superpowers striving to have the biggest and most powerful on their side. It was with this goal in mind that the Soviet Union launched a project to develop a multi-turreted heavy tank so large at the time that it would be likened to the equivalent of a naval battleship for the land. When the T-35 was conceived, it was to become the only heavy tank ever built with 5 turrets. In World War II, several of these T-35s were sent to the Battle of Brody, considered by some historians the greatest tank battle of the war, but none of those T-35s returned home. In 1929, the Council of People's Commissars was tasked with overseeing upgrades to the Soviet armored forces, particularly the building of medium and heavy tanks. Russian tank development had lagged behind since the Russian Revolution, and the Soviets had only had access to British-model medium and heavy tanks seized during the war. USSR did not have the experience or people with expertise to task with such an important assignment, so they hired German engineer Edvard Grote to lead the project at the OKMO Design Bureau within the Obukhov State Plant. Grote's team began working on a line of TG, Tank Grote, prototypes. Inspired by the British independent A1E1 design, which had 5 turrets but remained stuck in early development, Grote designed the TG5, a massive 100-ton tank. Unfortunately, it did not move to production, as it was far too complex to build and operate, and it didn't receive support from the Office of Mechanization and Motorization in the Red Army. The leadership of the Red Army was impressed by the ambition, nevertheless, and allowed the general team to pursue an alternative project. By fall of 1933, the T-35, designed by another team headed by engineer N. Tzitz, was ready for production, and 2 models were assembled at the Kharkov locomotive factory in Ukraine. A few adjustments were made to those original 2, and the main model was finally sent to production in 1935, with around 40 being assembled by 1940. The T-35 was a massive beast and was often referred to as a, quote, land ship. It featured 3 cannons paired with 2 machine gun turrets and 2 37mm guns. The whole tank stood at over 11 feet, 3.5 meters tall. It integrated the main turret used for the T-28, a 3-turret tank, standardizing some production elements between the 2 models. The main turret on both was equipped with an 11-foot, 3.5-meter long, 76.2mm low-velocity gun. The T-35, however, did not have the additional rear firing gun featured in the T-28. Some of the multiple tank variants produced had minor weapons alterations, with at least one featuring a flamethrower in place of a gun. Among its other less impressive features was its underpowered 500-horse M17M engine, which let the tank advance at only about 18 miles per hour, 29 kilometers per hour. At 30 feet, 10 meters long, the tank was also unwieldy to man, requiring a team of 10 who communicated through 6 intercoms. The team included a commander who would operate the main gun, an assistant commander for the front cannon, a 45mm gun, a junior tank technician to supervise movement of the tank and its technical condition, a driver to fire from the 3rd tower machine gun and to serve as a backup driver, 3 artillery commanders to fire from the turrets, a driver mechanic to load the 4th turret and care for the undercarriage, another commander to operate the rear machine gun, a senior radio telegraph operator, and 2 optional external staff members to care for the tank in case of a mishap. The original T-35 was paraded on May Day in 1934 and heavily featured Soviet military propaganda. As Francis Pullum wrote in his Tank Encyclopedia, quote, "They were symbols of the new industrial and military strength that the USSR had gained over the previous decade." Yet by the end of its production, only 61 of the tanks had been made, limited due to the high cost of assembly, which at around 525,000 rubles would have been enough to build nearly 10 light to medium tanks. Impressive as it may have appeared, the T-35 was far from perfect. In fact, it may have been said that the tank had more flaws than positive features. Both the driver and tank commander had extremely limited visibility from their stations, Coordinating the large crew while trying to shoot was difficult. Safety was another huge issue. The exit hatches were next to the gun turrets, which meant they could easily get blocked if a turret lost mobility or if it was destroyed over the hatch. Early models also sacrificed armor thickness to accommodate the weight of the massive frame. 30mm thick armor was placed at the front, with only 20mm of steel along the sides, back, and turrets. The armor was upgraded during subsequent modifications in production, with the final models featuring 50 to 70mm frontal armor and 30mm armor on the turrets. But unfortunately for the Soviets, that meant that the weight increased from 49 to 54 tons, which slowed down the already slow T-35 to about 8 miles per hour, 13 kilometers per hour at maximum capacity. Worse yet, the gearbox and transmission could not withstand going at maximum speed for long, constantly breaking down and preventing the T-35 from reaching combat zones, which happened before the Battle of Brody. The Battle of Brody has been called the biggest tank battle ever, depending on your definition of battle during World War II. Over 3,000 Soviet tanks and 1,000 German tanks met in open combat at the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Axis invasion of Soviet Russia. It was the first time that T-35s engaged in real combat. The invasion began in 1941, with the USSR deploying more than 3,400 tanks to the towns of Dubno and Brody. Out of the 58 built and ready T-35s, 48 were sent to be used by the 62nd and 68th Heavy Tank Regiments. The rest went to military schools or were kept in storage for further modifications or minor repairs. The tanks were sent on a week-long bumpy drive defined by poor tactical mobility and mishaps, crossing the unpaved path between Weber and Ticha while German bombers attacked from above. Out of the 48, 26 broke down on the way to battle, mostly due to transmission failures. Spare parts were unavailable, and most of the broken-down tanks were abandoned by the Red Army. An additional 8 had to be left behind since ordinary repairs couldn't be carried out after their regular service periods had been ignored. 4 more were lost under almost unbelievable circumstances when 2 got stuck in a swamp and 2 fell through bridges due to their heavy weight. Records suggest that maybe only up to 10 T-35s ultimately faced off against German forces in scattered engagements. For all their turrets and imposing size, it did not fare well. Although they managed to eliminate 2 Panzer IIIG tanks, 2 of the T-35s were destroyed by shell attacks and 2 by air offensives. Post-battle photographs captured these 4 defeated T-35s. Overall, the Battle of Brody resulted in the loss of around 1,000 tanks for the USSR and around 300 for Germany. On paper, the Red Army should have had an overwhelming numerical and technological advantage, but suffered mightily when exposed to German aerial superiority. Most of the Soviet defenders were said to have lacked adequate training, and their formations were not prepared to mount the counterattacking pincer move commanded of them. Other historians argue it was a breakdown in leadership that was to blame for the Soviets being routed, and that the counteroffensive could have been successful if it had been maintained. In fact, it is said that the Germans were, quote, horrified to find that the Soviet T-34, KV-1, and KV-2 tanks were nearly impervious to tank fire and anti-tank weapons. The Soviets unfortunately only had 443 of these machines on hand, and Germany's low-level bombers were able to break up most of the counter-attacking Soviet forces. Following the battle, around 4 or 5 of the remaining T-35 tanks were defeated by the enemies in almost immediate subsequent smaller skirmishes. The First Battle of Kharkov was the last fight in which T-35s were actively used for their intended purpose, and it resulted in the Germans capturing one of them, which they sent to the Kummersdorf Tank Museum. This particular tank surprisingly became the last T-35 to be used in battle, although not in any traditional way. The T-35 at the Kummersdorf Museum, serial number 715-62, was later marshaled as part of the Kampfgruppe Ritter tank group assembled by the Germans in April of 1945 to defend the Zossen area. As the Allied armies narrowed in on Berlin, the Wehrmacht sought to do what it could to protect its holdings and citizens. In an act of desperation, they took everything useful from the Kummersdorf Museum. While the 715-62 had been inspected and deconstructed to no end, it would still prove useful in the last few days of war. The Panzer Brigade that received it, though, had no use for it as an actual functioning tank. The 715-62 worked as a vehicle, but uncertainty marked whether its guns could actually work after everything that had been removed. It was safer to find an alternative use for it, and so the Germans used it as part of their stationary defensive walls in Zossen. On April 22, 1945, Soviet forces overran the town and reclaimed their land battleship from the barricade. On April 24, 1943, John Oscroft was ordered to take and hold an enemy position identified as Point 174 alongside the 2nd Battalion Sherwood Foresters. It would be the young man's first time seeing action, and he was feeling anxious and uneasy. Still, Oscroft found some relief in knowing his battalion would be supported by 9 friendly tanks, but as the brutal battle raged on, the tanks were nowhere to be seen. Fighting valiantly, and after severe casualties, the British soldiers captured the enemy position on top of the hill, but soon spotted 2 dreaded Tiger Is. The newest German tanks were a mighty and devastating weapon, a remarkable achievement of German engineering and one of the most technologically advanced armored vehicles in the entire global conflict. As the tanks overwhelmed their position, the soldiers dropped to the floor to take cover. Tiger 131 was quickly approaching, and Oscroft suddenly took his Piat anti-tank weapon and aimed it. With no reinforcements on site, it was their last chance at survival. In 1941, as the Third Reich executed Operation Barbarossa in a swift attempt to conquer the Soviet Union, German troops were shocked to learn that the Soviets had many more T-34 medium and KB-1 heavy tanks than expected. The Soviet tanks were mostly impervious to tank and anti-tank guns, and according to Henschel designer Erwin Otters, quote, "There was great consternation when it was discovered that the Soviet tanks were superior to anything available to the Heer. The grave development would be a significant obstacle if Germany wanted Barbarossa to be successful, and Hitler needed the new Panzerkampfwagen 6, which had been in development for almost 4 years, to be deployed as soon as possible. The war depended on it." Henschel and Sohn had been developing what would eventually become the Tiger as far back as January 1937, when the Waffenamt requested them to develop a Durchbruchwagen, or breakthrough vehicle, in the 30 to 33-ton range. Initially, just one prototype body was created, and it was never equipped with a turret. The model bore a striking resemblance to the Panzer III, and at the same time, its turret was similar to the one on the early Panzer IV-C. Still, the prototype was deemed inadequate, and the project was postponed. When the design was revised in 1941, the Tiger's development was approached with a completely different philosophy compared to earlier German tanks. Its predecessors balanced agility, armor, and firepower to create outstanding and versatile vehicles, but they were usually outgunned by their adversaries. Something different was needed. This time, German technologists went all out, taking the vehicle to the absolute engineering limits at the time. While heavy, the Tiger was not slower than its lighter counterparts, but it packed much more firepower than most. A great deal of the Tiger's carried load stemmed from its 4-inch thick armor, which made the vehicle much more resistant to anti-tank armament. In comparison, the Soviet T-34, the tank that had stunned the Germans as they advanced through Russia and other Soviet states, was fitted with 2.56-inch plates. The 56 caliber 8.8 cm KWK-36 main gun mounted on the Tigers also surpassed the firepower delivered by the T-34's 76.2 mm cannon or any other Allied tank. With a combination of a flat trajectory from the high muzzle velocity and precision from Leit's Turmzielfernrohr TZF-9B sight, the Tiger's main gun was highly accurate and devastatingly lethal. The tank also needed a powerful engine and an unparalleled suspension system to carry such groundbreaking technology. Thus, its tail end held an engine compartment flanked by 2 individual rear compartments, each containing a fuel tank and radiator. The engine was developed exclusively for the Tiger by the Maybach Company of Berlin and under the technical leadership of Karl Maybach. The engineer would produce the engines for all the medium and heavy German tanks of World War II. The first Tiger engine was a V12 water-cooled gasoline model with a capacity of 1,302 cubic inches and a power output of 650 brake horsepower. The Maybach HL210 TRM P45 was a remarkable work of engineering that provided a colossal amount of power considering its size. In addition, the suspension worked with 16 torsion bars, with 8 suspension arms per side. The swing arms were leading on one side and trailing on the other to keep the suspension system from taking too much space. There were 3 road wheels on each arm, in a so-called Schaft-Terlaufwerk overlapping and interleaved arrangement, comparable to that established on German half-track military vehicles of the pre-World War II era. The Tiger I would be the first all-track German armored fighting vehicle built in quantity to use such a road wheel arrangement. Still, all the groundbreaking features came at a hefty price, and at over 50 tons deadweight, the suspension, gearboxes, and other such systems had evidently reached their design limits. Even more, breakdowns would be frequent without regular maintenance, and the engines also tended to overheat, making constant upkeep crucial. Despite its limited flaws, the Tiger I was an agile and fast behemoth. When initially deployed, no Allied tank could even hope to penetrate the Tiger's incredibly thick armor or stand a chance against its powerful 88mm cannon. As the tank made it to the Eastern Front and then to Africa, it became almost impossible to fight it in conventional ways, and it would take several Allied tanks to defeat just one of these German brutes. After 2 years stationed at home, awaiting a German invasion that never came, the British 2nd Battalion Sherwood Foresters were eager to return to the front lines. As luck would have it, they were sent to northern Africa to assist in the final stages of what would be known as the Tunisian Campaign. Most of the 2nd Battalion members were veterans who had fought in France at the outbreak of the war and had been forced to withdraw at Dunkirk. However, the returning unit was bolstered by a large batch of new recruits who had yet to see any action. Amid these inexperienced newcomers was Private John Oscroft, who felt anxious about his incoming first combat operation. He and the rest of the 2nd Battalion were especially concerned to learn that Germany had deployed Tiger 1s in the African theater. The sheer notion of fighting one of these quasi-mythical machines was enough to make the new recruits very nervous. For their first mission, the Sherwood Foresters were tasked with capturing an enemy position on the outskirts of Gueria el Attaque. The Germans had taken control of a broad hill dubbed Point 174, which provided a considerable tactical advantage to the faction controlling it. Oscroft felt uneasy. The position was heavily defended, and the Germans had the high ground. To make things worse, there was always the possibility that they might have Tiger support. Still, the young recruit found solace in knowing their attack would be supported by 9 Churchill tanks, which would be an enormous advantage. However, as the charge for Point 174 began, the Churchill tanks were nowhere to be found. They had been delayed, and the attack had to proceed without them. The Foresters fought a savage uphill battle, rushing several heavily defended positions while suffering significant casualties. Still, they made it to the top and secured the hill without the support of British armor. Unfortunately, their triumph was short-lived, and they watched in horror as a Panzer company rushed their position. Among the tanks were at least 2 Tigers. The German tanks soon overwhelmed the hill, forcing the Foresters to immediately drop and crawl to avoid the Tigers' fire. Oscroft watched as the world fell into chaos and disarray, and the British soldiers scrambled. The young private had been given the privilege of carrying a Piat and was suddenly ordered to strike the incoming Tiger 131. Oscroft then positioned himself as close as he dared to the enemy juggernaut and fired, but the projectile struck the side of the turret and bounced off, leaving the vehicle unharmed. The situation was getting more dire by the minute, and the Foresters knew they wouldn't be able to keep their position for long. However, out of nowhere, the 9 Churchill tanks suddenly appeared on the battlefield and began firing at the German tanks. Tiger 131 immediately returned the fire, instantly destroying an Allied tank. The Allies then concentrated their efforts on the 131, with 2 Churchills firing at it simultaneously. As the tanks were firing at each other, a group of soldiers remembered that they had captured a 75mm cannon from the Germans and used it to fire at the German heavy tank, but the attack was mostly harmless before the Tiger's formidable armor. At that point, something unexpected happened. It's unclear if it came from the cannon or the Churchill round, but a lucky projectile encrusted itself on the Tiger's turret gear mechanism and completely disabled it. The sudden malfunctions then fooled the Germans into believing that the Allies had much more firepower than they actually possessed, and the crew immediately opened the hatch and fled in panic. As the battle raged on, the British forces ultimately prevailed. Furthermore, it was the first time the British had captured a Tiger. The captured tank soon became a sensation, but several experts and military engineers examined it before it was taken from the battlefield. The capture of a working Tiger was so important that even Prime Minister Winston Churchill took a photo with the vehicle during a visit to northern Africa. The tank would be studied and explored minutely, and the information gathered would not only help the Allies combat other Tigers, but also fuel innovation in tank design for the next decade. To this date, Tiger 131 remains the only intact and working Tiger 1 in the world. For decades, the capture of Tiger 131 had been credited to another battalion fighting in a different battle in North Africa. It would take a chance visit from John Oscroft's son to the British Tank Museum for the world to discover the true story. As Dale Oscroft read the information displayed on the Tiger 131 exhibit during a visit in 2009, he realized the details were remarkably similar to a story his father told him. After careful research, Dale was able to prove that his father and the Foresters had been the ones responsible for the capture of the legendary Tiger 131, finally unveiling the true story behind the iconic feat. After the successful Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940 that significantly extended Germany's domains, Adolf Hitler prepared its armies to conquer the Soviet Union. However, once the previously undefeatable Panzer III and IV tanks faced the Soviets' most devastating tank, the T-34, Germany realized it had seriously underestimated the enemy. The German tanks were no match for the Soviet behemoth, and the military quickly put in motion the development of a new medium tank that could tear the enemy's armor apart. The new tank would be baptized as the Panther because of its impressive armor, power, and agility, and in a desperate race against time, Hitler would rush its production to be ready for the Battle of Kursk. However, when the pivotal clash against the Soviets finally broke out in July of 1943, the Panthers would be deployed into combat for the first time without any test trials, with many even facing the enemy without machine guns. It was a desperate last offensive on the Eastern Front, and the Germans' fate significantly depended on the Panther. When World War II broke out following the invasion of Poland in September of 1939 by the Third Reich in the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht had the most effective tanks ever produced. They were fast, agile, rugged, and powerful. The Panzer IIIs and IVs blended the benefits of each segment perfectly, and the result was the utter devastation of the enemy forces. Coupled with the effective coordination of infantry, armored vehicles, artillery, and aircraft, the Blitzkrieg Doctrine helped the Germans take over most of Europe during the first years of the war, and no Allied tank was able to stop the Teutonic Panzers when they retaliated against the French and British in June of 1940. Given the tank's outstanding performance, the German High Command did not feel the pressure to develop more robust and heavy armored tanks, but it all changed when the Führer finally decided to launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in June of 1941. As the most considerable invasion force in all of military history charged against the Soviets, they quickly realized that they had underestimated the Red Army's capabilities. German tankers and engineers were surprised by the sheer quantity and quality of the Soviets' armored vehicles, and the T-34 and the KV-1 heavy tanks proved to be the toughest vehicles on the battlefield. The German turrets had a rough time trying to stop T-34 units because their guns were simply not powerful enough to penetrate their armor. Before the invasion, the arrogant German intelligence believed that the Soviets' designs had not progressed enough since the last days of the 1920s, when both nations ceased working together on tank and aircraft tactics. And although the Soviet tanks were hastily built following the Soviet ideology of mass production, they were agile and potent. The KV-1 was impenetrable against any anti-tank gun except the 88mm cannon, and the T-34 had excellent armor, a powerful gun, and top-notch speed packed into a sub-30-ton tank. German shells simply bounced off from the T-34's frontal armor, while the Soviet 76.2mm cannon quickly shredded advancing panzers. Consequently, the German High Command realized that it was imperative to develop a new medium tank to replace the Panzer IIIs and IVs against the fearsome Soviet T-34. At the insistence of General Heinz Guderian, one of the pioneers of the Blitzkrieg Doctrine and the Panzer Division concept, a tank commission was created to study the T-34 and develop a German medium tank with similar capabilities. The Panzer Commission was then sent to the Eastern Front, and after analyzing several captured T-34 tanks, they concluded that the tank's most significant innovation was its sloped armor, which greatly increased the armor's thickness and shot deflection. In addition, the Commission assumed that the use of wide tracks was the reason behind the T-34's outstanding mobility over soft and rough terrains. When it came to weaponry, the Germans needed a gun as powerful as the 76.2mm cannon used by the T-34, with its excellent muzzle velocity accuracy and armor penetration. Then, in November of 1941, Guderian's commissions pointed out that the future tanks would require at the very least heavy armament, higher tactical maneuverability, improved armor protection, and several anti-tank guns capable of shredding the enemy's armor. The Führer immediately ordered to begin work on a medium tank that could defeat the T-34, and the German Armaments Ministry quickly issued a proposal to develop a tank inspired by the enemy's devastating vehicle. The specifications asked for a weight between 30 and 35 tons, armor protection that ranged from 40 to 60 millimeters in thickness, a top speed of about 55 kilometers per hour, and a 75mm L-70 gun in a traversing turret. Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg AG, or MAN, and Daimler-Benz, or DB, who had worked on the Panzer III and the STU G3, were then tasked by the ministry to come up with hull prototypes for this new Panzer. Meanwhile, Rheinmetall was chosen to develop the 75mm gun turret. The prototypes were designated VK3002 and were scheduled for delivery in early April of 1942. The VK30 design, developed by Daimler-Benz, greatly resembled the T-34's turret and hull, and was powered by a diesel engine, while MAN's design featured the sloping armor of the T-34, but had a conventional mid-mounted turret and a gasoline engine. On the other hand, Rheinmetall delivered a cast steel hexagonal design with 125mm of armor thickness. The forward section held the cylindrical 75mm cannon, and a curved mantlet protected the gun. Also, the sides were angled inwards to provide maximum ballistics protection. Once the prototypes were finished, they were reviewed by the Armaments Ministry and personnel from the Heer's top brass. Both Fritz Todt and Albert Speer convinced Hitler that Daimler-Benz had the superior design, but the Führer decided to carry out his own research before settling on a final verdict. Hitler then ordered the Daimler-Benz design into production, but this decision was overturned by the Ordnance Department. After a lengthy evaluation, they had concluded that MAN's proposal was better suited for immediate production, as the Rheinmetall turret was not compatible with the Daimler-Benz chassis. In addition, the German engineers believed that the strong resemblance to the T-34 would lead to confusion on the battlefield. The first pre-production models were ordered in May of 1942 under the name Panzerkampfwagen 5, but the new medium tank would ultimately be identified as the Panther. In his book Inside the Third Reich, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer wrote, quote, "Hitler ordered that the T-34 be copied, and the result was the Panther." Despite the new tank's technical superiority over the Soviet T-34, early models would be plagued by dozens of problems, as Hitler rushed their production to be ready for Operation Citadel, and they were not adequately tested. Citadel was part of the June 1943 offensive at the Eastern Front, which aimed to shatter the Red Army once and for all. The first 250 Panthers were expected to be delivered 1 month before the ambitious operation. Mechanical failures would ultimately render some tanks useless, and the Germans knew it. Still, the Army was in dire need of every available armored vehicle against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Soviets. The Panther was manned by a crew of 5, a commander, driver, radio operator, loader, and gunner. It had a length of almost 9 meters, a width of 3.43 meters, a height of 3 meters, and weighed between 45 and 50 tons, depending on the variant. While production was ramping up, the final Panther design changed dramatically. Its 60mm armor was increased to 80mm, increasing the 35-ton Panther's weight to over 43 tons, thus making it more of a heavy tank. Such weight put tremendous stress on all the tank's mechanical components, but it still managed a speed of 46 kilometers per hour and an approximate range of 180 kilometers. Besides its devastating 75mm cannon, the Panther also had 2 MG-34 machine guns and a grenade launcher for use against infantry. Speer added, quote, "The Panther was larger and much better quality than the T-34. The Panther's suspension system was more complicated than that of the Russian T-34, involving torsion bars and 18 overlapping road wheels on each side. Wide tracks spread the Panther's weight while traveling over soft ground. Its 75mm gun was a vast improvement on the Russian equivalent." The first 900 Panthers were identified as the version D variant. They were followed by the version A model, which increased armor thickness and changed the turret. The version D had an improved engine, while the last variant, the G model, featured more armor tweaks and a new chassis. A Panther II was eventually proposed, but only one prototype hull was completed. When the Battle of Kursk began on July 5, 1943, only 184 out of 200 Panthers were combat ready, with some of them even lacking machine guns to defend themselves against the infantry. A week later, the number had dropped to about 140 tanks after several malfunctions, including motor fires. Days later, the German offensive was brought to a halt after significant armor losses had diminished its momentum. Guderian wrote during these days that, quote, "Due to enemy action and mechanical breakdowns, the combat strength sank rapidly during the first few days. By the evening of July 10th, there were only 10 operational Panthers in the front line. 25 Panthers had been lost as total write-offs. 23 were hit and burnt, and 2 had caught fire during the approach march. 100 Panthers needed repair. 56 were damaged by hits and mines, and 44 by mechanical breakdown. 60% of the mechanical breakdowns could be easily repaired. Approximately 40 Panthers had already been repaired and were on their way to the front. About 25 still had not been recovered by the repair service. Despite the mechanical failures, the less than 180 operational Panthers destroyed over 270 enemy tanks. But by August of 1943, when the Soviets had turned to the offensive and the Germans had been pushed back, only 9 active Panthers remained. Thanks to its high elimination ratio, the tank still proved its worth and paved the way for upgraded variants. The highest number of Panthers in active service peaked in September of 1944, when German reports estimated that over 520 were fighting at the Eastern Front and 480 in France, including in the Normandy Campaign, the Battle of Caen, the Battle of the Bulge, and Operation Grief. According to testimonies from tankers, as many as 4 American Shermans had to be called upon to tackle a single Panther tank. Most of the mechanical problems that had affected the Panther's performance had been solved by then, and it became the Wehrmacht's lead battle tank. Still, Speer later reflected that, quote, "Production of the Panther was slow, and there were never enough of them to make a serious difference to the fighting in Russia, Italy, or Northwest Europe." The war then neared its end, and the tank factories were decimated by the Allied bombing campaigns. When Berlin surrendered, the surviving Panthers were taken by the victorious nations, and some were incorporated into their armed forces, especially those that fell under the Iron Curtain. Also, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all ordered the production of some Panthers to conduct trials and inspect their performance. In total, over 6,300 Panther tanks were produced during World War II, and many of them can be appreciated in numerous museums around the world. On June 24, 1941, during the desperate fight to defend Rysiny in Lithuania from the massive German offensive, one Soviet KV-2 tank crew decided to stop and make a difference. While the Soviets retreated in masses, the KV-2 tank bravely held off the enemy as long as it could before the much-needed reinforcements arrived. The valiant crew would hold the advance of the entire 6th Panzer Division for a whole day, defending the only road through which the Germans could advance and continue their invasion as part of Operation Barbarossa. The lone KV-2 tank fought to the last man while outnumbered and outgunned, but when the fight was finally over, the unthinkable happened. After the annexation of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and ultimately Poland, the United Kingdom and France decided to go to war to prevent Germany from becoming a world power once again. While this happened, Adolf Hitler had signed a secret peace treaty with Stalin. Both nations took over half of Poland, and the Reich turned its attention to face its Western counterparts. Still, their armies ramped up production and began to concentrate along the borders of the USSR. Then, on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history was launched, and over 4 million Axis soldiers marched into the Soviet Union across a front that was more than 2,500 kilometers long. During the first days of the offensive, the Blitzkrieg forces advanced relentlessly, pushing back the Soviet armies without any resistance. It seemed as if the Germans were going to reach Moscow in days. However, Soviet forces began to slowly regroup, and after the initial concussion, quickly reorganized with tens of thousands of fresh recruits. Although the German Army Group North penetrated Soviet defenses without any significant problems, the conquest of the Lithuanian city of Rysiny proved more complicated than expected. The objective was to take control of strategic river crossings in Lithuania, which comprised the Neman and Dubysa rivers near Kaunas and the village of Rysiny. Over 250 German tanks from Kampfgruppen Raus and von Scheckendorf, a part of the 4th Panzer Group from the 6th Panzer Division, then began making their way through the town, seizing their objectives. However, they were baffled by a new enemy they'd been unaware of. The Klement Voroshilov Tank II, also known as the KV-2, had armor so thick that no German panzer or anti-tank weapon at the time could penetrate it. Unfortunately for the eager German infantry, they would find out the hard way. When the Germans first saw the KV-2 tank in action, they knew very little of this secret Soviet heavy vehicle. Named after the Soviet People's Commissar and Minister for Defense, Marshal Klement Voroshilov, the KV-1 heavy tank was developed months before the Soviet-Finnish War erupted. The tank had a length of 6.67 meters, a width of 3.35 meters, and a height of 3.25 meters. It also weighed 52 tons and was manned by a crew of 6, while its maximum speed was 28 kilometers per hour and had an operational range of some 200 kilometers. However, this varied depending on the version. Its main armament consisted of a 152mm M10 howitzer with 20 rounds and 2 DP-27 machine guns with over 2,000 rounds. The main innovation of the KV-2 was its armor, which proved immune against the 3.7cm KWK-36 and 7.5cm KWK-37 guns mounted on the German Panzer IIIs and IVs. The KV-2 also proved unbeatable against most German anti-tank weapons, forcing the infantry to resort to flank tactics to destroy them effectively from behind or with direct fire from 8.8cm flak guns. The massive vehicle was used for the first time during the Winter War against the Finnish, where the slow and clunky KV-2 metal beasts slowly closed in on the Mannerheim line, wholly exposed to enemy fire in a display of military superiority. However, the Finns eventually found a way to take them down by launching grenades and Molotov cocktails and even planting satchel charges. Despite their impressive armor, the tanks were not invincible. When the formation of 250 Panzer III-5Ts faced the armored columns of over 750 Soviet KV-2 tanks on June 22nd, the ground trembled. The Germans could not believe that their 3.7cm KWK-34 guns barely scratched the armor of the heavy KV-2s. Even worse, the entire Soviet motorized defense force attacked the German garrison in an unstoppable violent wave. Although the Soviets attacked the German forces after their flanking maneuver failed, they quickly went through the infantry and artillery formations thanks to their heavy armor. Suddenly, a ferocious close-quarters combat broke out between the infantry, tanks, and artillery guns. The Germans quickly regrouped, closed ranks, and began to attack from afar to prevent more casualties at the hands of the powerful cannons from the KV-2s. Still, the Soviet tanks did as much damage as possible before running out of ammunition, and when they did, they simply approached the German anti-tank guns and ran over them. According to Maxim Kolomiets, editor-in-chief of the Front Illustration magazine, a German captain that went by the name of Zelvach wrote in his diary, quote, "This morning, our headquarters and I reached the road fork northeast of Versailles, and panic set in. A few super-heavy Russian tanks broke through our positions, went to our rear, and caused great confusion and destruction. A large number of vehicles, guns, and even 150mm howitzers, which fired to the last, were simply crushed and rolled into the ground. The situation was overshadowed by the fact that our guns did not penetrate his armor. I myself saw from a close distance how this Russian monster received 8 direct hits from our 75mm tank gun and quite calmly drove on. The tight coordination that ground forces had with the Luftwaffe helped the panzer groups to counterattack. Luftlotte 1 provided extensive support to halt the Soviet advance, while the Germans prepared their 88mm anti-aircraft guns to tear the Soviet KV-2s apart. Only then did the German forces begin to take control of the field. As the Soviets ran for cover from the guns, the German infantry snuck up from behind and planted sticky bombs on the tracks of the tanks to immobilize and destroy them. The 6th Panzer Division lost about 200 men, 30 tanks, and 40 motorcycles, but managed to push back the surviving KV-2 tanks. Late in the afternoon, Combat Group Seckendorf received reinforcements, while the forces from Kampfgruppe Raus eliminated the remains of the Soviet resistance. During the night of June 23rd, the civilians in the vicinity watched a lone and battered KV-2 tank approach the main road and plant itself in the middle to prevent any other vehicle from passing by. It was the back road through which the Germans were supplied. The tank would not move again during the 5-day battle, and the witnesses even believe the crew ran out of fuel, left the tank during the night, and forgot about it. Then, on June 24th, a convoy of Soviet prisoners and wounded German soldiers approached the road and watched the lone KV-2 tank from afar. The vanguard believed it was left there to rot, but then something strange happened. One of the front drivers watched in awe as the tank's turret slowly turned and then stopped, aiming at them. He blinked, puzzled, and an instant later, a whistling sound pierced the air and passed close to the convoy. The Germans quickly turned around and returned to base to ask for more tanks to eliminate the KV-2. but it was too late. An hour later, a convoy of 12 trucks carrying fuel and ammunition was utterly destroyed by the lone KV-2 standing in the middle of the road. Traffic jams rapidly formed on both sides of the road. The offensive was slowly getting stopped by one Soviet tank burning under the suffocating sun. Colonel Erhard Rouse quickly dispatched troops to destroy the tank, and a battery of 4 50mm AT guns fired 7 shots at the KV-2. However, nothing happened. Then the turret slowly turned, aimed at the German crews, and fired. The KV-2 remained still, and an 88mm was then brought to destroy it from 700 meters. While the crew prepared the weapon, the tank stood silent and then fired one accurate shot, destroying the gun. Colonel Rouse would later recall, quote, "It turned out that the crew and the tank commander had nerves of iron. They coolly watched the approach of the anti-aircraft gun without disturbing it, since as long as the gun was moving, it posed no threat to the tank. Then came a critical moment in the duel of nerves, when the crew began to prepare the anti-aircraft gun for the shot. It was time for the tank crew to act. While the gunners, terribly nervous, pointed and loaded the gun, the tank turned the turret and fired first. The KV-2 then terminated the other 2 20mm AAs that were brought along, and Colonel Rouse decided to send sappers with dynamite to get rid of it. However, they had to wait until the morning. Meanwhile, as the sun went down, another attack by the infantry carrying explosives failed. But when the morning came, Colonel Rouse mobilized a column of panzers to distract the tank, and the infantry with explosives approached from behind to get close. While the KV-2 tried to aim at the enemy tanks, the timid infantry raced for the vehicle and threw grenades through the armor holes to finish the crew. They then ran for cover, and the tank soon exploded. Upon inspecting the tank, the Germans found the remains of 6 men. Colonel Rouse and his men were so impressed by the crew's bravery that they decided to bury them with full military honors. The remains were then transferred to a cemetery in Rosini in 1965. The names of the 6 road warriors remain unknown to this day. When World War II broke out, the light tank was merely a tracked scout with lackluster armor and armament. Still, the U.S. Army employed the reliable but underwhelming M3 Stuart during its campaign against General Erwin Rommel in North Africa. However, the expertise learned from this combat experience led to the creation of the ultimate light tank of World War II, the M24 Chaffee. Also known as the Panther Pup for its similarity to the German tank and its inclusion of sloped armor, the M24 was also armed with an effective 75mm cannon, a 50 caliber machine gun, and twin 30 caliber Browning guns. With a top speed of 35 miles per hour, a range of 100 miles, and excellent off-road capability, the Chaffee became the spearhead of armored formations when the Allied forces crossed the Rhine to defeat the Third Reich. Moreover, its operational service lingered well after that global conflict. British and American combat experience during the North African campaign showed the severe deficiencies of the M3 and M5 Stuart light tanks. Although the tanks were reliable and fast, their design went back to the 1930s, and the M3 was almost obsolete by 1942 standards. The tank had thin armor and a high silhouette that made it an easy target for Axis tanks. Furthermore, its 37mm gun was almost useless against the superior German panzers. Although the idea to replace the M3 Stuart dated back to 1941, when the U.S. was readying itself for war, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps didn't take it more seriously until 1943. In partnership with the Army, the Cadillac Company began the development of the T-7 tank, which was to be equipped with either a 57mm or 75mm main gun. The vehicle eventually became the M7 medium tank, but was cancelled shortly after, as it exceeded the weight limit of a light tank. Cadillac and the Army then began working on the light tank T-24 project, which retained some characteristics of the M7, including its 75mm cannon. By October of 1943, the first prototype was delivered to the Army for testing, and minor modifications were made, including adding a vision cupola for the tank commander. After several trials, the Army put an order for 1,000 vehicles, but it quickly increased to 5,000 to replace the active M3 and M5 Stuarts as soon as possible. Production began in April of 1944, but really picked up in June, when the M5 Stuart was finally cancelled. The need for a new light tank with an upgraded gun, better armor, and mobility followed several reasons. The first was the urgent requirement to replace the outdated 37mm cannon, which was no longer effective against German and Axis armor. Secondly, the armor protection of the M3 and M5 Stuart was no longer deemed adequate for the rapidly changing circumstances of armored warfare. The American tanks had become too vulnerable against the superior Wehrmacht panzers and Axis anti-tank artillery. As such, new protection was needed for the reconnaissance units, as they were the eyes of the main armored formation of US and British forces. The tank's job was to race ahead of the primary formation and scout the areas nearby to gather intelligence about hostile enemy strongholds or units in the vicinity. If located and properly identified, the M3s and M5s had to report the location of the enemy forces, call in an airstrike or an artillery barrage, and leave the area without making contact with the hostile forces. These types of lightly armored vehicles were not meant to participate in direct combat actions, so they relied on their superior speed and maneuverability to get out of harm's way. Still, the war in North Africa took the role of armored reconnaissance to the next level, as numerous skirmishes simultaneously took place across vast desert landscapes where dunes, hilltops, and desert storms occasionally became the hiding spot for ambush units. With counterparts such as General Erwin Rommel, who earned the nickname the Desert Fox for his leadership and strategic abilities, the Allied forces had to go to great lengths to confront the Afrika Korps during the North African campaign. The M24 light tank was nicknamed M24 Chaffee, in honor of Major General Atna R. Chaffee Jr., who was considered the father of the armored force. After making the last tweaks to the prototypes, the final version of the M24 light tank that was shipped to Europe weighed over 19 tons, had a length of 18 feet with the main gun forward, a width of 9.4 inches, and a height of 8.1 feet. It had enough space for a 5-man crew, which comprised a tank commander, a loader, a gunner, the main driver, and an assistant driver that was also the radio operator. The M24 had a conventional tank layout, with the driving compartment located at the front, the fighting compartment in the center, and the engine section at the rear. As a light cavalry tank, the M24's armor was relatively thin when compared to medium battle tanks. It had a maximum thickness of 1.5 inches at the gun shield. The front glacis was just 1 inch or 25 millimeters thick, and the sides and the turret also measured the same. Meanwhile, the top of the hull was only 10 millimeters thick. Still, the implementation of sloped armor slightly increased protection if compared with the thicker but flat armor of the M5 Stuart. Notably, the armor thickness on the hull was not uniform. Although the front was 25 millimeters thick, the hull's side protection decreased significantly, to the point that the area that protected the engine compartment was only 19 millimeters thick. The M24 Chaffee was powered by 2 liquid-cooled Cadillac 44T24 8-cylinder gasoline engines that generated 110 horsepower each. As a result, the M24 could achieve a top speed of 35 miles per hour with a maximum range of 175 miles thanks to its 100-gallon fuel tank. Wide steel block tracks that were 16 inches wide provided the traction, and a conventional torsion arm suspension was used for the dual-track wheels. A compensating wheel was placed at the rear of both sides to maintain constant track tension, while dual controls were provided for both the main driver and the assistant driver in the case of an emergency. Its main armament comprised a 75mm gun with 360-degree traverse capability, and the tank had the capacity to shoot 48 rounds. In addition, secondary armament included an M2 50-caliber machine gun mounted on a pintle at the turret's rear for use against aircraft, and 2 30-caliber M1919 Browning machine guns placed in the turret and in the bow for use against infantry. Finally, the tank had a capacity for 440 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition and 3,750 rounds for the 30-caliber Browning machine guns, while a 2-inch mortar could fire smoke grenades. The first M24 Chaffee tanks began arriving in Europe after the completion of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, in August of 1944. The first 50 M24 tanks were received by the U.S. Army 2nd Cavalry Group in France. In fact, the 2nd and 42nd Cavalry Squadrons were the first to operate them, in skirmishes across the sectors fortified by the Germans. From then on, the M24s began slowly replacing the M3s and M5s, which, according to some armored force observers, were so useless that they were used as anti-tank gun bait for the M4 Shermans. As more M24s began to make their way to the front lines, Hitler launched one of his last offensives of the war, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944. When the American forces entered combat against the Germans during the harsh winter, the first group of M24s followed them, but the fighting quickly turned confusing because of the constant snowfall and several communication problems. Scattered firefights soon broke out, and entire units were encircled. In the ongoing chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, 2 M24s who were to link up with the 744th Tank Battalion ended up with the 740th. The two Chaffies saw combat near La Glaise and Stoumont, Belgium, where Kampfgruppe Joachim Peiper was stopped in his tracks while pushing through the Meuse River. By early 1945, the Army had begun training more crews with the M24, but given the innovation of the tank's sloped armor, many soldiers often confused it with the German Panther. This earned the American M24 its second nickname, Panther Pup. The M24s were the first tanks to spearhead the crossings across the Rhine in 1945, and they would see action during the Ardennes and Alsace regions, the Rhineland, Italy, and the campaigns in Central Europe during the last months of the war. Meanwhile, the United States Marine Corps rejected the M24, and no Panther Pup ever saw action in the Pacific. The British Army received 300 M24 Chaffies through the Lend-Lease program prior to the end of the war, but only a handful of them saw actual combat. Most were sent to India, and others were given to the Dutch Army. Post-war reports from the armored divisions were mostly positive. Tankers were pleased with the performance of the M24, especially regarding the 75mm cannon and its off-road performance. Although the M24 was still inferior to most German tanks when it came to armor and damage, its 75mm gun and increased speed and maneuverability still gave U.S. crews a fighting chance. When the war ended, the American M24 tanks were used in Germany, Austria, and Japan for occupation duties. These same tanks stationed in Japan for peace duties were then rushed to South Korea when the Communist North abruptly invaded its neighbor on June 25, 1950. The Panther Pups were the only tanks the U.S. Far East Command could dispatch to the Korean Peninsula to support its allies. As such, they were rushed to the front lines against the Communists to support the 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division. Most of these M24s were not adequately maintained and occasionally failed. Moreover, as light tanks, they underperformed against the powerful Soviet-made and North Korean-operated T-34 vehicles. Still, the brave American and South Korean forces held the line, and the underpowered M24s were able to destroy 8 hostile T-34s before the U.S. Army rushed large numbers of M4 Shermans and M26 Pershings to stabilize the front line. The surviving M24s were then used for reconnaissance roles with other vehicles for the remainder of the war. In the post-war, the U.S. supplied its allies with surplus M24s, and NATO allies such as Norway, Turkey, Belgium, and Italy all received tanks. Out of all the allies, France received the most Panther Pups, and over 1,250 French Chaffies were used in Algeria and Vietnam for their colonial wars. The M24s were deployed by the French Army during the escalating tensions against the Viet Minh and the communist sympathizers supported by China and the Soviet Union in French Indochina. While there, the light tanks were mostly used for infantry support missions. However, the harsh terrain, the weather, and more importantly, the Viet Minh's use of artillery and explosives left many Chaffies out of commission. Several M24s were even deployed via airdrops to support the French troops encircled at Dien Bien Phu during the decisive Battle of 1954. Ultimately, the surviving M24s ended up in the hands of the Army of South Vietnam once the French retired from the country in 1955, and some were used in the coup attempts of 1963 and 64. All in all, more than 28 nations used the M24 as part of their armored forces, and more than 4,700 were produced before the legendary model was replaced by the M41 Walker Bulldog light tank.